Hi class, this is Jeff Boggs, and today we're going to talk about Peterborough and the Autonomy Conservation Authority. During last week's mini lecture, we learned that Peterborough is situated or located along a series of canals and waterways built or expanded on during the 1800s. In particular, we learned that the city of Peterborough sits athwart or sort of in the center or along the Trent Severn waterway, which is a series of canals connecting Lake Huron with Lake Ontario. So these were originally designed as a way to reduce the, if you will, the friction of distance or the cost of transportation and the speed of transportation for bulk transportation of timber, grains, and other kinds of bulk goods like iron ore, coal. The Trent Severn's waterways, its role as a transit corridor was eventually replaced initially by railroads, and then in the 20th century, as automobiles became more important, by paved roads and highways. What this means is that now the Trent Severn waterway primarily serves as a kind of a tourist and recreational boating attraction. And this conservation authority, then, the Autonomy Conservation Authority, is all of this area, sort of I don't know if you can see my yellow marker or not, but kind of it's all in here. And it sort of captures the watershed that drains here and eventually empties into Lake Ontario. Turn off that, okay. So autonomy, this conservation area sits, I guess surrounds the city of Peterborough, which is this area in red here. So city of Peterborough, which is its own sort of a governmental entity. We'll talk about that in later weeks. And this autonomy conservation area is one of 36 that exist in Ontario. Ontario's conservation authorities were first formed in 1946 under the Conservation Authorities Acts 1946. And they're organized along three basic principles. So these conservation authorities are organized along three basic principles. The first is local initiative. Hold on, let me bring this back up. So the first is local initiative, meaning that before they are formed, local citizens and municipalities have to be willing to cover part of the costs and staff these organizations. So there has to be some local popular support for these before they are created. The second principle is cost sharing, meaning that any projects that are proposed by a given conservation authority needs to be funded in part by local taxpayers and in part by the province. And the third principle is that they are organized along a watershed jurisdiction. This means they are organized around specific watersheds, which allows them, among other things, to manage flood control. So what this means is that you need to have a local population that's willing to share the cost to control land use practices within a particular watershed to control floods. Because floods are actually costly and are prone to all kinds of if you're an economist, you might think of this in terms of negative externalities. So one person's decision on their property can make floods worse for people essentially downstream or further along in the watershed. So there's one might think of this as it's a solution to a collective action problem. Hurricane Hazel in 1954 prompted calls for conservation authorities. And this is a useful example to illustrate a tendency in democratic human societies or even non-democratic human societies that legislation often changes in response to catastrophes. So often when there's a catastrophe, people get killed, lots of property gets damaged, and many citizens become very upset by that and want to try to make sure that's not going to happen again. And so they will either organize or put power on legislation or legislators or some combination thereof to try to prevent or minimize these kinds of catastrophes in the future. What happened in 1954 is that Hurricane Hazel struck southern Ontario. Its winds, or her winds, this was back when hurricanes were only named after females. Hurricane Hazel's winds and the rain that it brought proved such a catastrophe. So the winds reached over 110 kilometers per hour, and there was over 28 centimeters of or 280 millimeters of precipitation in the course of 2 days. Which doesn't seem like a lot, except if you are downstream from that, if you are in a low-lying area, all the precipitation that was dumped on areas higher than you, especially if the path of that precipitation after it hits the ground as it runs along is runoff, if the path for that goes through your property or where you live, that can be catastrophic. So in the wake of Hurricane Hazel, 81 people died, thousands were left homeless, bridges were destroyed, many houses were swept away into Lake Ontario. And so the public reaction to this catastrophe led to demands for tighter regulation of construction on floodplains and in wetlands, as these sites had been the location of much of the destruction caused by Hurricane Hazel. So these 81 dead, these thousands of people left homeless, these many bridges destroyed, these tended to be located in low-lying areas, so floodplains and swamps. So historically, people will fill in swamps so that the ground becomes dry. But when you fill in a swamp, one of the features of a swamp, or one of the, I suppose, swamps occur in floodplains and next to floodplains, sort of coexist with them. So these are all areas that they're floodplains. So, or if they're swamped, they're wet all the time. These are areas that are always in danger of being wet. And when you build in those areas, so, and by being wet, I mean having, the river or creek or stream overflow its banks and sort of rampage through your property. So building in those areas can be problematic. And conservation authorities, ultimately, we can think of them as they provide a public good. So if you're a housing developer or real estate developer, you probably aren't going to like conservation authorities. You're going to consider them a nuisance, as they basically say, look, you cannot build houses here in this floodplain. So they restrict the growth of housing. However, at the same time, conservation authorities, by protecting floodplains and wetlands from development, they allow more natural systems of water catchment to function, but while also limiting flood damage. Basically, they provide a place for all the floodwaters to go. And if you ensure that people aren't living there, then people are less likely to drown or have their houses swept away. So I find them a useful kind of public infrastructure. So by preventing construction in areas prone to floods, they mean we don't waste as much money on preventing floods in areas that are built up. So, or we don't spend as much money cleaning up after floods because we had sense enough to not allow people to build in areas that were going to flood. And so again, property developers, they don't care about this because once they sell the land that has been developed, they're off the hook for any costs, right? And so then it falls on the homeowner, who then will appeal to the government and people's kind-heartedness to bail them out. So whereas if we just say, look, you can't build here, then it saves everybody a lot of trouble. So yeah, so remember here that if you build in a floodplain, so if you live in a flood-prone area, you are going to be the one who has to bear the cost of these poor planning decisions as long as you live there. So by restricting development from floodplains and wetlands, conservation authorities protect lives, property, and taxpayers in the future, right? They also reduce the need to provide disaster relief for damage on flood-prone land. And again, property developers don't like this because it reduces the opportunities for them to turn a profit. Construction companies don't like this either. House building companies don't like this. Home builders don't like it. But, you know, I don't see why I, as a taxpayer, should have to subsidize somebody else's bad decision if I adopt a kind of mercenary hat about this, right? So there we go. That is why public goods include things like conservation areas, because not everybody has sense enough not to build in a floodplain. One final point to all of this is that conservation areas incidentally protect habitat. And by incidentally, I mean the main reason, at least for establishing conservation areas, and I would argue maintaining them, is that they protect human property and human lives, or they reduce costs to society so that we don't have to pay the cost of people that drown on floodplains or the cost of, you know, having their property swept away. That's really the main purpose of a conservation authority. Incidentally, which is actually a nice thing, is that they also protect habitat. So in protecting these floodplains and wetlands from development, conservation areas, they incidentally protect habitat that tends to have relatively high biodiversity, especially if we think in terms of wetlands, but also areas, and this high biodiversity is partially related to what some people would call, you know, high levels of primary productivity. So these wetland and riverine environments, these floodplains, tend to be areas that, from an ecological perspective, receive lots of resources. And so they're this interface between land and water. And you'll often find in these areas, so like even like, say, river deltas or coastal areas as well, you'll find these are areas that have a lot of biodiversity because it allows creatures to live on land but hunt in the water. It also allows for more vegetation frequently and more variations in the kinds of species. So in terms of biodiversity, these tend to be relatively more biodiversity rich and locations, and this is directly related to the kinds of resources, nutrients that are sort of found in these areas. as a result of them being places that flood. But I would again argue that while that is all really awesome, and I'm supportive of that, that the main reason, at least originally, that we have conservation authorities was not to protect habitat, but to protect human lives. So that is something to bear in mind. But if you are interested in biogeography, then it might be that when you are in Peterborough, that the conservation authorities have basically provided you a site in which you might be able to conduct research. Though you probably have to get permission from them. Okay, that is the end of this lecture. Thank you.